We are continuing with Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad, having completed the chapter titled The Great Transition, where Sri Aurobindo has described the relationship between our existence here, which is an inferior existence, to that which is the divine, superior, original existence, of which this is a part, a projection, a partial expression. The next chapter discusses how we are to make that transition. But before we can discuss the transition itself, he raises a question, which in fact is raised by the Kena Upanishad itself. And the Kena does not represent it as a question, but as setting of the relationship of the divine consciousness with our world experience. And the relationship is set through a series of paradoxical statements. Sri Aurobindo takes all these and articulates them in terms of the modern mind, as if the mind were asking this question. And so, this is the text we are going to see now, the new chapter that we begin, chapter 12 of Sri Aurobindo's commentary. He starts with this. Before we can proceed to the problem, how, being what we are and the Brahman being what it is, we can effect the transition from the status of mind, life and senses proper to man to the status proper to the Supreme Consciousness, which is master of mind, life and senses, another and prior question arises. So in a single sentence, he has summarized the situation that we are living in a consciousness which is of the mind, life and senses proper to our human experience. And there is the consciousness above, the Supreme Consciousness, which is master of mind, life and senses. And there is to be this transition from the lower to the higher. And before we can proceed with this problem, there is a prior question. And that question has to be dealt with because the moment you speak of two levels, one being so different fundamentally from the other, the question is asked, how is it, or what is that level itself? Is that really the highest? Or is there something still higher? Are we stopping short when we set up this relationship? And so he says, the Upanishad does not state it explicitly, but implies the question and answers it with the strongest emphasis on the solution and the subtlest variety in its repetition of the apparent paradox that is presented. So the whole question is actually of a paradoxical kind. And that's why the text places it as a paradox. I will briefly read the first of the verses, of 5 verses, which discuss this paradox. And it will give us a sense of what Sri Aurobindo is talking about. In the translation, Sri Aurobindo writes, if thou thinkest that thou knowest it well, little indeed dost thou know the form of the Brahman. That of it which is thou, that of it which is in the gods, this thou hast to think out. I think it known. So, the first statement is, if you think that you know the Brahman well, then you know, if you think you know the form of Brahman well, then you know very little. What you are, what the in-between cosmic powers that are the gods, that you have to know. In other words, there's a contradiction here. We want to know the Brahman, but if you think you know the Brahman and the form of Brahman, then you have not got it. What can you know? The only thing you can know is what you are, and perhaps a little bit of what these cosmic powers are. The next verse, I think not that I know it well, and yet I know that it is not unknown to me. So now he's setting up the relationship with what is the absolute Brahman. You cannot know it, and yet it is not unknown. So there is a relationship, but the relationship itself is not in the overt surface awareness. He of us who knows it knows that. He knows that it is not unknown to him. So it gives a clue of how we are to know. But all this we will discuss in detail later. And then the third verse. He by whom it is not thought out has the thought of it. He by whom it is thought out knows it not. So the moment you think about it, you do not know it. And the only way to know it is by not thinking of it. And then it continues, it is unknown to the discernment of those who discern of it. By those who seek not to discern of it, it is discerned. So the whole thing is paradoxically stated that those who try to discern, that is, if you apply your mind's process of knowing, then it is unknown to you. Those who try not to apply this process of knowing, then you know it. So it is again, and then finally, fourth verse. When it is known by perception that reflects it, then one has the thought of it, for one finds immortality. By the self, one finds the force to attain, and by the knowledge, one finds immortality. And here the solution is given. If you know it by perception, which is not trying to maintain it, which is not trying to think it out, but which reflects it, then in the reflection you have the thought of it. And there you find the immortality. But the self, and by the self, you find the force to attain and the means of gaining it are described. And by the knowledge, you get to the immortality. So this whole verse, very cryptic, will be elaborated in the rest of this chapter. For now, we are just getting the sense of the paradoxical formulations which the Kena uses. And finally, the fifth verse, which has been referred to earlier. If here one comes to that knowledge, then one truly is. If here one comes not to that knowledge, then great is the perdition. Meaning here, in life, in the body, if you gain it, that knowledge, which is the knowledge of the immortality, the Satchidananda, then you are truly, meaning then you are truly yourself. But if you don't get it here, then you have lost something extraordinary. And he continues, the verse continues, the wise distinguish that in all kinds of becomings, and they pass from this world and become immortal. That is, from this state of consciousness, you rise into the state of immortality, the Satchidananda, by knowing all the becomings of that, all the gradations of consciousness by which it manifests. So straight away, before even we have a deeper sense of these 5 verses, we notice that the Kena is discussing multiple levels of consciousness. It is telling us that our current way of knowing with the mind is insufficient. And if it thinks it knows, then it has only caught a tiny piece of it, because that's all it is capable of knowing. And yet there are gradations. And it is possible to receive by reflection that which cannot be attained by process of cognition. And then you can gain it. But what is it that you seek to gain? Not these in-between states, but all the way, and not that in abstraction, but all these as expressions of that. This is the true knowledge. So there is now an idea of something which is the highest absolute, which is totally unknowable. And then there are all these in-between gradations which are itself, in the way it knows itself and the way it manifests itself, all the way to what we are, and we ourselves are that. But we can only know ourselves partially because our way of knowing is still undeveloped. But it is possible for us, therefore, to know because we ourselves are that, but we can know that only when we know that entirely. So this is broadly the direction of the 5 verses. Now Sri Aurobindo, with his incisive perception, places the question in a bare form. The master consciousness of the Brahman is that for which we have to abandon this lesser status of the mere creature subject to the movement of nature in the cosmos. So first the relationship is this. There is a master consciousness of Brahman. We are abandoning our lesser status for that consciousness, not this world itself. We are abandoning the status of consciousness. Why is this lesser? Because here we are merely creatures, subject to nature. What nature forms in us, that is all we can be. What nature drives in us, that is what we end up doing. We are almost like a puppet. And so for that, we want to disengage from this lesser status and awaken to that greater status, but here, as master. But then comes the question, but after all, this master consciousness, however high and great a thing it may be, has a relation to the universe and the cosmic movement. It cannot be the utter absolute Brahman superior to all relativities. So the moment we have conceived of this master consciousness as the master of the universe, then there's a relationship. Then the question comes, is this itself a part of the process? This cannot be obviously the absolute superior to all relativities because it is in the movement itself and has a relationship with the movement. So he continues, this conscious being who originates, supports and governs our mind, life and senses is the Lord. But where there is no universe of relativities, there can be no Lord. For there is no movement to transcend and govern. Is not then this Lord, as one might say in a later language, not so much the creator of Maya as himself a creation of Maya? Do not both Lord and cosmos disappear when we go beyond all cosmos? And is it not beyond all cosmos that the only true reality exists? Is it not this only true reality and not the mind of our mind, sense of our sense, life of our life and word of our speech, which we have to know and possess? As we must go behind all effects of the cause, must we not go equally beyond the cause to that in which neither cause nor effect exists? Is not even the immortality spoken in the Veda and Upanishads a petty thing to be overpassed and abandoned? And should we not reach towards the utter ineffable, where mortality and immortality cease to have any meaning? Now, when placed like this, the question is so convincing. It actually forces us to recognize that all that we were saying so far as the Lord, ruler of this inferior form and consciousness, that itself seems to be almost a product of something which belongs to the relativities. If we go beyond to the utter bare, beyond all form, there is no Lord there, even as there is no universe. When we go beyond cosmos, there is no question of a Lord of the cosmos. Is not then the Lord itself as if a creation of the Maya rather than creator of the Maya? Of course, he reminds us, a later language. So, if we go beyond where there is no universe of relativities, there is no question of lordship. Lordship can only exist when there is some relationship. And the moment you say there is a relationship, you are in the relativity. So this question is quite overwhelming when you think about it. If you pursue purely with logic, you would stop here and say, yes, this is true. We have to get beyond the idea of the Lord. The Lord itself is part of the relativity. We must go into the utter beyond. where neither universe exists nor the Lord. And then the immortality of the Veda and the Upanishad is meaningless. We have to go beyond cause and effect to a consciousness where there is no question of cause and effect. And you will see how this has been the prime focus of many of the ascetic traditions. Both the illusionism of Vedanta as well as the nihil of the Buddhist approach is aiming at something like this, going into a transcendence where nothing remains. Sri Aurobindo explains this relationship now with these ideas. He says, the Upanishad does not put to itself the question in this form and language, which only became possible when nihilistic Buddhism and Vedantic illusionism had passed over the face of our thought and modified philosophical speech and concepts. So he is referring now to a great change that took place in the mind and the speech of humanity as a result of the passage of the nihilistic Buddhism and Vedantic illusionism. But before that, these thoughts, these changes didn't exist. And so the Upanishad itself uses a language which is proper to its age. What is that? Sri Aurobindo writes, but it, the Upanishad, it knows of the ineffable absolute, which is the utter reality and absoluteness of the Lord, even as the Lord is the absolute of all that is in the cosmos. Of that it proceeds to speak in the only way in which it can be spoken by the human mind. So the Upanishad is making a distinction. It knows that there is this inferior form and expression of the conscious universe. It knows there is a greater existence, which is the divine existence, which is the Lord. And it knows that the Lord of this universe has his own absolute status, which is the absoluteness of the Lord in his utter reality. And that is the superior poise of the Lord, even as this Lord is the superior poise of our universe. And it knows this. Knowing these three distinctions, it begins to express it in, he says, speak in the only way in which it can be spoken of by the human mind. So how is the mind to speak of something which is itself so different from that which it knows, and then to speak of something else which is equally different from that which it knows, and yet it can conceive of them? We are speaking of these things, we are using a language, but it's not enough to have a logical statement treating these three things as different things. We have to look deeper into what they represent in relation to each other. And even though we are dealing with ideas of the mind, the ideas can give us a clue. Later on, Sri Aurobindo will tell us that it is not wrong to mentalize. The error is when we take our mentalization as the only thing and the thing itself, and then we stop with it. There are even today certain schools of illusionist Vedantic philosophy which accept that understanding that all this is illusory is enough. That beyond that, you do not have to do anything more. Just the understanding of it will begin the process to free you, and you will disengage from the illusion, and at some point you will break out and get free. That is their belief. And so they do not even have practices for inner, deeper concentration to rise into higher states of consciousness and so on. Equally, in their practices, paralleling the nihilistic Buddhist practices, they have a process basically of abandoning layer by layer, part by part, all that we are, until they come into some kind of a pure, bare, minimum life. Variations to this, which exist, which are much more meditative introspective and seek to realize higher or deeper states of consciousness, will go through a monastic process of withdrawal, but deeper into consciousness, whereby at some point the mind is stunned or killed to free you and break out into something which is beyond mind. But again, no in between, no connection, no passage, no continuity to that. An absolute, and then all the rest is the relative. And so there's a cutting of reality. That's why Sri Aurobindo refers to this as the trenchant solution. And when the Buddha set out to find the solution to the problem of suffering, he found this to be the shortest, most direct way of getting free of suffering. He does not say this is the only way, but he says this is the shortest way to be free of suffering. You get out of all sense of existence, because along with existence comes suffering. And the shortest way is to get out of the existence. The longer way is to change the consciousness of your existence. And that takes too long. But the question we have to ask is, what is our sense of purpose? Is it simply to get out of existence, extinguish everything, to be free of suffering? Or is it to disengage from the distortions of our consciousness which make suffering the reality, and bring forward a deeper, truer, higher consciousness of immortality, Satchidananda, Amritam, in which there is no suffering, and which can manifest here in our mind, life, body, in the material world, in every tiniest detail, eventually. But the process will take time. The process will involve effort. The process will involve a series of steps of purifying and liberating from our distortions before we can even begin to touch that consciousness, and then a long process before that can manifest and in our mind, life and body. And the question is, which is it that we choose as our way? From a very objective perspective, spanning the millions of years, billions of years of evolution, we will see that we have come to this point where we can question and make this choice by a process which has itself been doing exactly what we would want to do if we wanted to realize and manifest this immortality here. It has been moving in that direction, and that is what we have called evolution. Step by step, an emergence and freeing up of our consciousness, but not getting out of the material world, but manifesting in matter all these higher gradations and possibilities. And now we stand at a point where we can make a choice: get out of it or continue the process now more rapidly, consciously. And obviously, if we apply a very simple logic, the logic that we entered this by choice, therefore the goal was not to get out of it suddenly in between, but complete the journey. From the beginning, that was the goal. If the goal was simply to get out at the earliest opportunity, why would we get into this in the first place? And why, when in the first phase of the development, we have passed through the most difficult passage and now we are beginning to open directly to the higher possibilities, why then to escape? When you are able to see, to sense, to perceive the higher Satchidananda, it seems to be now tangible and accessible. You can even conceive of it, and in your highest states perhaps touch it and know it. Why then, when the solution is so close, should one want to escape? And in one of his letters, Sri Aurobindo observes that it is indeed because it is in the realm of possibility to get out of the whole thing. It is indeed true that there are some souls who come with this intention. They enter the manifestation to experience the withdrawal at the earliest opportunity. But this is not true for the bulk of us. For most of us, the goal is to be in this in order to be able to complete what otherwise is an extraordinarily and even an impossibly beautiful manifestation of the Satchidananda here in the mind, life and body. The divine consciousness, not merely living in its pure, essential, bare, formless, spaceless truth, but entering to manifest in the domain of space, time and form, not just as a concealed potential divinity, but to a fully revealed, manifested divine consciousness of divine knowledge, divine power, divine beauty, divine love and divine bliss, completely exposed, revealed, without any layers to conceal. That is the extraordinary future towards which the entire cosmos has been laboring. And we are at this transition point where we have the choice to continue this and complete it, or to get out of it, having suffered enough in our awakening. And then you know what you would choose. Something so beautiful when it is visible before you and the goal is within reach, well, we will continue. And yet, we have to understand this question which has been posed. What is it that is the Lord then? Is not the Lord only that pure, bare abstraction, or is He also these? And what is the relationship between all these three levels? Now, if you look back at the text, you will see how it makes these distinctions. Looking at the first verse of the second part of the Kena, if thou thinkest that thou knowest it well, little indeed dost thou know the form of the Brahman. So straight away the discussion is about form of Brahman as distinct from the essence and absolute of Brahman. In order to have form of Brahman, well, there has to be the domain of relativities. But in the relativity, what enters is not Brahman, it is form of Brahman. But in this perception of the relativities, if you think you know Brahman and his form, then you know very little of it. That of it which is thou, that of it which is in the gods, this thou hast to think out. I think it known. So now it reminds us that Brahman and form of Brahman is not out there somewhere in some transcendent, barren, spaceless, timeless reality. It is here, and that of it which is you. That means that is all these things, and of which a small part of that is you. You are that Brahman. And that you have to think out. And that of it which is in the gods, even in the gods that Brahman exists, that you have to think out. So it says here you have to think out. And then later it says, if you think it out, you cannot get it. In verse 3, he by whom it is not thought out has the thought of it. He by whom it is thought out knows it not. So right at the beginning it says you must think of it, and then later it says you can't get it by thought. So you see in the verses there is a progression teaching you how to get to that realization. And the first step is you must think of it. Because that's the only tool you have, the only means by which you can know it. And the means proper to your human mind is this. And use the means. But not make the error to think, now that I have thought of it, now that I have understood, I have got it. That would be the error. So, we start by thinking of the Brahman. In what way? Well, there is already what we are reading, and we could describe it as philosophical or metaphysical thought. But there's another kind of thinking, which is not merely rational thinking. All of this will only set a background. There's another kind of thinking. As when you think of the beloved, what happens when you think of the beloved as you work? You brood upon, you dwell upon, you continue to hold in immersion that. And as you continue to do that, it is not a rational thought, but it is the mind experiencing itself dwelling on a theme, an idea, and in that idea, a certain quality of the relationship, perhaps of devotion, perhaps of self-giving, perhaps of love, perhaps of closeness, perhaps of immanence. All this also is Brahman. And just that thought, without any devotion perhaps felt. Perhaps even the thought that all my thoughts are nothing but ripples in the Brahman. And even my thinking is caused by the Brahman. My feelings are waves and ripples in the Brahman. My actions are only ripples of his energy in movement. So there could be many kinds of themes one could set for oneself. To a mind which is much more fixed in form, we could start with objects. This vast mountain is Brahman. This tree is Brahman. Or gradually break free of the forms and conceive of this empty space in which everything holds is Brahman. This expanse of time in which everything unfolds is Brahman. And so, through a series of such steps, starting with whatever level one finds natural for our current development of consciousness and mind and emotions and personality, one turns to dwelling on the Brahman in thought, in feeling, in action, in particularities and gradations of form, to gradations of formlessness, to abstractions. But when we dwell with the heart, the abstraction is no more felt as a barren abstraction. It is felt intensely close. So when the heart dwells on the idea that all this around us is nothing but the presence of the Brahman, the heart exults in joy in the intimacy, because the Brahman is not out there, it's not just in the tree, it is in my heart, in the very heartbeat. And the very flow of joy and love in my heart is the joy and love of the Brahman. And the intimacy felt there is profound. In the thought dwelling thus, similarly, there is an intimacy that grows. We may think at first, oh, this is an abstract idea, but it is not. When you begin in thought to conceive of all this filled with presence of Brahman, my thoughts being ripples in the presence of Brahman, the thought also feels an intimacy. And then in the actions, if you think of it initially, oh, I'm making an offering to the divine, where is the divine? Far away. So you have the sense of a distance and abstraction. But if in your action itself you think of the divine as being present in your tissue and nerve, in the object which you're working on, in the thing towards which you're working, on which you're working, all this is Brahman. Again, the sense of closeness and intimacy grows. So one starts from wherever we are, and as one deepens, there may be the idea that it is an abstraction because Brahman is some abstract truth. But the reality is, it is a growing closeness and intimacy, becoming more and more vivid and intense, until one is so overwhelmed as to see, feel, know, and express oneself towards only the Brahman in and through everything in life. And thus is it that we can come to the realization of that here. And that's why verse 5 says, if here one comes not to that knowledge, if here one comes to that knowledge, then one truly is. If here one comes not to that knowledge, then great is the perdition. We got into this journey to experience it here. And then one truly is, because now you know yourself as a part of and an expression of Brahman. So the 5 verses which lead us from the thinking of the Brahman to that which becomes the realization of Brahman, these 5 steps are now described by Sri Aurobindo in the rest of this chapter. But by having placed the problem in these terms, we can understand how important this question is and what a profound knowledge these 5 steps or 5 verses are revealing to us. Except that when they were formulated, this kind of thought of Brahman being an abstraction in an absolute, away from the relativities and so on, was not there. That came with nihilistic Buddhism and Vedantic illusionism. And having come, all the words used by the Upanishads got therefore distorted, we may even use the word corrupted, in the common understanding. And he gives a specific example here. He says, in the question he posed, is not then this Lord, as one might say in a later language, not so much the creator of Maya as himself a creation of Maya? And the Maya term you will find in the Veda, you will find it also in the Vedantic illusionism, but in a very different sense. So Sri Aurobindo takes pains in his commentaries on the Veda to point out that the original sense of the word Maya is the measuring out. The root sound Maya is to measure out. From that which is absolute, immeasurable, unknowable, indescribable, ineffable, you measure out and make possible to know. You make possible to feel and identify in relative terms and experience in relativities. And that power to measure out is a creative power. But what that creativity does is it draws out from the absolute the experience of measuring out in relativities, which is magic. How can that which is unknowable be made knowable? Isn't that magic? How can that which is ineffable be now not only tangible but conceptualizable and knowable in various ways? That is magic. So that power which is the creative power, the original Maya of the Veda, is a creative power of Brahman. In fact, Brahman himself in the movement and power of manifestation. In the Vedantic illusionism, when this question was placed in these terms and this idea made of a cut, a separation from Brahman and the world, the question is only where you cut. So you could say all this lower knowledge, mind, life, senses is what you cut out as the illusion or pain, suffering. Beyond is the Lord, divine consciousness. Or if you apply the logic and say there is a cut, then logically that divine consciousness and this being related and that itself being in relation to you needs to be cut out and is part of the illusion, is part of the suffering. Get out beyond of that. Get out of that. Get out of that. Anything you reach, if it is knowable, if it is experienceable, if it has a relationship with this and you can access it from this consciousness, belongs therefore to the relativity and knowability and is therefore not that. And so the cutting process goes higher and higher until it reaches its limit. Beyond this is the unknowable, ineffable, indescribable transcendence. Since it is indescribable, unknowable, ineffable, you can't talk about it, you cannot know it. And suddenly reality has been cut off. And this is then what happens. What's the way out? There is no way out except by killing mind, which is what binds you into this experience of inferior reality or unreality, whatever dream you may call it. But then Sri Aurobindo says, the moment you say Maya is now this illusion, because all this is now called an illusion, unreal, then you have to ask, is the greatest power of Brahman a power of illusion, of deception? There's something wrong with that. And then you could ask, who is experiencing the illusion? Is not the one who experiences the illusion essentially free still? Is not yourself still spaceless, timeless and free? How does he enter this poise of the illusion and experience of the illusion? And the illusionist answers that by saying, well, that itself is part of the mystery of the illusion. You cannot know, and it's part of the skill of Maya to have trapped you into this question and in this perception. There's no answer to it. But that is not a satisfactory position either. If you can say that the last question has no answer, then the same logic could push back the barrier of cut and say, well, if you cannot answer the question, then your assumption is wrong. And step by step we reclaim everything, come back to the recognition that all this is not illusion, but is manifestation of Brahman in various degrees and gradations of his own self-limitation. But there is no cutting of Brahman, there is only one continuous reality, which is whole, of which the highest extreme is beyond time, space, and inner transcendence, is only the highest poise of Brahman, and this is the lowest poise of Brahman. But Brahman is all that exists. There is no illusion except our perception of Brahman, which may be illusory by its distortion or limitation. So in this way, logically, one could swing to cut off reality and then get to something which is a kind of a logical jam where you say, well, we cannot answer beyond this. Or with the same logic, we can come back and reclaim which is true. And the answer will not come with the logic. The answer will come by a deeper perception which says, yes, to see the whole as the Lord is more true than to see the Lord cut up into something which is not Lord and which is Lord. That doesn't make sense. The root of this cutting up process, which happened later, cutting up of reality, the root of it, Sri Aurobindo points out, is in the limitation of the Vedic experience. That in the Vedic experience they saw all as the Lord, but they saw the body merely as a support for this experience and perception of the Lord. They did not bring that divine consciousness all the way into the body itself being made to participate, matter itself being made to participate in the experience of the Lord. The matter being inert, inconscient, was left merely as a support, a base for the form and the world of forms in which we can know and experience the Lord. Obviously, this was not a limitation in potential, it was just a limitation of what could be done in the state of evolution then. But the moment, Sri Aurobindo says, the moment you leave out one part of the reality as not divine or not divinizable, there's a cut you have created in reality. And then the cut rapidly shifts. You can play with where you cut, it goes all the way to the highest and cuts off the whole of the reality. Because all of these are connected and related in a continuity of the levels of consciousness. So, this is the big picture of why this division comes. And there is a particular form and language specific to Vedantic illusionism and nihilistic Buddhism, which passed over the face of our thought and modified philosophical speech and concepts. So all the conceptions of the earlier Vedic and Upanishadic articulation now got distorted into this vocabulary. Maya now has a different meaning. The place of the gods, the place of the lordship, and so on have a different value. But this Upanishad is not making these distinctions or not making these divisions. It is making distinction only as levels of experience of the same Lord. And therefore it can say, you must know that of which you are a part and which is within you as a part. So, its answer to the problem is that is precisely the unknowable of which no relations can be affirmed and about which, therefore, our intellect must forever be silent. So yes, you cannot know that highest station. Intellect has to be silent. And then the injunction to know the utterly unknowable would be without any sense or practical meaning. Not that that is a nihil, a pure negative, but it cannot either be described by any of the positives of which our mind, speech, or perception is capable, nor even can it be indicated by any of them. So this is obvious to us, that if we are to know that, You cannot say you must know the unknowable. It doesn't make sense. You will recall Sri Aurobindo joking about this when Paul Richard had come and spent days in discussion with him. He would always start by saying, let us speak of the ineffable. And by definition, the ineffable cannot be spoken of. So how do you expect to be able to know the unknowable or speak of the ineffable? But that's the way the philosopher in us wants to. Let's brood on, let's think of, let's dwell on, let's meditate on. But there are many ways, as we saw, to do that. The injunction to know the utterly unknowable would be without any sense or practical meaning. But that is not a negative. It is just that, he says, there's nothing in us which is capable of describing that. As a very simple exercise, conceive of empty space. Easy to do. Conceive of an expanse of time. Yes, a little more difficult, but you can still conceive of the universe and an empty space across millions of years. Now conceive of something which is spaceless and timeless. And suddenly the mind is stunned. How do you do that? The only way you can remove space is by removing it and leaving behind an empty space, which you have to keep removing. But how do you conceive of something which is not empty space and not time? And the only way it can do it is if it kind of withdraws, the mind withdraws into itself and becomes a point where there is no sense of space or time. The expansion means space. The moment there's form, there's space. Empty of form is still empty space. But spaceless, you can withdraw into something like a point where you extinguish all sense of form, or get into some kind of abstraction, getting behind all concept of anything into a kind of a blankness. The point is really the form of blankness, which is why we even represent as a point sometimes the highest truth. But that's the best the mind can do. Still, this is a point of connection. And so we are going to accept all of these concepts, just knowing that none of them are sufficient in themselves to know that utter unknowable. But we don't want to know just that utter unknowable, we want to know all the gradations in between, including the Lordship of the Lord. So, Sri Aurobindo continues, it is only a little that we know. It is only in the terms of the little that we can put the mental forms of our knowledge. So whatever little we can know is all we are able to formulate. Even when we go beyond to the real form of the Brahman, which is not this universe, we can only indicate, we cannot really describe. Now, what do we mean by indicate? Well, we have used this word Satchidananda. Sat, Chit and Ananda. We have used the word transcendence. We have used the word higher consciousness, greater reality. What do we mean by all that? There is nothing obvious in our experience that we can say, this is what I mean. You can ask yourself, what do you mean by the word happy? Well, you can turn within you and you have an experience that you can relate to and say, this experience is what I mean when I use the word happy. But when you say Satchidananda, what experience do you refer to? You do not have it in you. At best, you have constructed with your mind something which is more than this, or something which has the quality of being indivisible oneness. What does that mean? Again, you have no experience. It's just a constructed idea. But these are the forms in which we are able to hold our knowledge. For the universe seen as our mind sees it is the little, the divided, the parceling out of existence and consciousness, in which we know and express things by fragments. But we can never really cage in our intellectual and verbal fictions that infinite totality. So what is it that we are doing? Our universe that we see with our little mind. Our little mind sees only pieces, the divided pieces of the universe, parceling out the existence and consciousness, in which we know and express things by fragments. So it's as if out of that humongous Satchidananda, whatever our idea of it is, some pieces of it we have parceled out in our glimpse of this universe, and those we play with pieces, with ideas, and we construct them and combine them in certain ways and say, this must be Satchidananda. But we are just playing with the pieces. And verbal fictions, and holding in the cage of our mind that which is infinite totality. Even the words infinite and the word totality are just words. Now, we must recognize, before we dismiss all of this mental, I will use the word manipulation, mental play, jugglery, before we dismiss it outright, which is the way of certain traditions, we must recognize that we can hold these ideas, we can hold these conceptions, because there is something actually in our mind which touches that. Something of that which enters and behind the processes and fragments of the mind, like an indication, like a pointer, nudging, suggesting. So when we say totality, okay, try to conceive of it with your mind, but you never get it. And yet the idea exists because something inside you knows it exists and is possible. So, verbal fiction, yes, but behind the verbal play, there is something which is pointing, something which is true. And that's why he uses this phrase that we are as if indicating, we are as if showing with a finger pointing to the moon. We never touch the moon, we never know the moon, we never step on the moon, but the finger points to the moon. But if you were to say, now my finger pointing to the moon has touched the moon and I know the moon, that would be the error. And yet there is a direction, and in the mind's thinking there is a direction, and the direction is true. The form of it is, of course, verbal fiction. Yet, he says, therefore, yet it is through the principles manifested in the universe that we have to arrive at that. Through the life, through the mind, and through that highest mental knowledge which grasps at the fundamental ideas that are like doors, concealing behind them the Brahman, and yet seeming to reveal him. So here comes the solution. How are we to know that which is unknowable? Well, we start by knowing what we can know. Because everything in the universe being a manifestation of that, it is as if that principle in its most essential level is right here held in this particular form through which it expresses, through which we seem to be able to grasp it. So when I say infinity, I have an idea, a constructed idea, which is not infinite at all. And yet I can grasp this. And that, as a fundamental idea, capital I, the idea of the infinite, is like a door. And the nature of this door is, it conceals behind them the Brahman, and yet seeming to reveal him. Through this door, it is as if a glow of the idea of the infinite enters my mind and awakens to my mind, which can only know finiteness, the concept that, yes, there is such a thing as infinity, or at least there can be, even if I can't experience it. And that's the door. And there are many such doors. And each of these fundamental principles through which Brahman manifests is for us like a door. So let's reread this last sentence. Yet it is through the principles manifested in the universe that we have to arrive at that. What are the things which that which is beyond the universe has manifested in the universe? Observe all. All the things which you can observe. And then get behind the form of those things to the principles behind by which these forms are created and known. And these in us are what we can know. You cannot know the tree in itself, but you can know yourself and the part of you that is one with the tree. The part of you that is one with everything in the universe. So, if you want to know the universe, truly, in itself, you must know the part of that corresponding within you where you are one with it and say, I feel happy. Therefore, now I can understand what happens when the animal jumps with happiness. I feel fear, and so I can understand, I think I can understand what the animal experiences when he has fear. But I can never know the fear of the animal itself, at least not as I am. But in a more liberated consciousness, I would experience all of those things within me. But for now, we start with ourselves, in our limited form and experience. What are we? Through the life, through the mind, and through that highest mental knowledge which grasps at the fundamental ideas. So in our life experience, we turn through the principle of the life experience and the principle essential truths of life experience, which we touched upon earlier, the bhakti, the love, the sense of intimacy and closeness in our hearts, the sense of consecration in our actions and in our will, and our thought dwelling equally. But in the domain of thought, there are higher gradations of thought, which he describes here as the highest mental knowledge. And at that point, it is as if we are grasping at the fundamental ideas, capital I. They are no more merely mental constructions, but glimpses of something which are self-existent ideas. So I can have my idea of an ideal universe, an ideal society, an ideal behavior of a person, an ideal experience of omniscience or omnipotence. But that's my constructed idea. But there is behind that the concept of omnipotence or omniscience, that it is possible to have all knowledge, that I did not construct. That is as if leaning into me from above, an essential truth. Having caught that truth, I may construct around it what it would be like. Can you imagine what it is like to know everything in the universe? Now your mind starts working, putting together pieces, exaggerating what is its limited experience, making it bigger and bigger. Yes, I could imagine. But that's not how it is. The true omniscience is not handling so much extra information. It is a state of consciousness in which you experience oneness with all things. In that oneness, you know everything because it is intimately you. So it is not a mental process, nor your construction will not get you to that. And yet the concept of omniscience came in as if leaning from above as a truth. Capital I, idea. Leaning in. And at that point, it touches something. The moment it enters the domain of thinking mind, it breaks up. The point where it ceases to be in thinking mind, there's an interface which is like a door. Through this door, if you enter, you experience something of it. You cross the door to this side and you have constructed ideas of it. And so through the door, it is as if concealing behind the Brahman and yet seeming to reveal him. It's revealing, something is coming through, but what comes through is not it. It seems to reveal. It gives us the sense of a glimpse of it. And you will recall in the previous chapter how Sri Aurobindo discusses the formation, the creation of the world using dualities, where the positives are pointing towards that, seeming as if to get to it, but never really getting it. And the negatives reminding you, this is not it. And nothing that you have got to is it. And so something of that double status is brought in the level of these doors. At the same time, the doors seem to give you a glimpse, seem to reveal him, and yet they block off, concealing what his true nature is. And this is accessible to us and everything up to this. And so we start, he says, through these principles manifested in the universe. We'll continue this text next Sunday. But later he says, therefore, that the truth which is beyond our mentality can be known by us, and we have to begin with what we are capable of knowing. But the condition of accepting our thought and its limitation as a starting point is not to take our mentalizing by the mind and our knowing by the higher thought for the full knowledge, and rest in that with a satisfied possession. We should not say this is it. As long as we are conscious of that, we can use these and must use these as our means. So this process and the importance of this the role of the gods in between, and then the gradations of the knowledge of Brahman, all of that is discussed in the rest of the chapter, which we continue next Sunday. We can briefly meditate on this and the Brahman and our idea of the Brahman, or whatever principle we can hold in our mind of the Brahman, in thought or even in our heart, and dwell on it for a few minutes.